Hi, I'm George, and the pop culture artifact that I'm going to be discussing in this video is The Lord of the Rings. More broadly, I'm going to make connections to other works of fantasy in film and television, and to the fantasy genre in general. I'm a huge fan of The Lord of the Rings. The films are truly epic in every sense of the word. Frodo and the Fellowship played a definitive role in my childhood, as me and my friends ran around waving sticks and pretending we were doing battle to save Middle-earth. The films are highly intelligent, engaging, and nothing short of masterpieces of modern cinema. Let's take a look at the mainstream fantasy genre prior to the Lord of the Rings films. Fantasy had traditionally been seen as a fringe or niche culture, and under no circumstances by any means was it considered cool. The 80s and 90s had seen the rise of the words geek and nerd, and these words were frequently applied to fans of the fantasy genre. Television shows played on these stereotypes. In a 1993 episode of The Simpsons, Homer plays Dungeons & Dragons, a fantasy board game with a group of nerds who display typically nerdy characteristics of awkwardness and social incompetence. It's not clear why there was such a negative connotation surrounding the fantasy genre. However, I would guess that in a time where youth culture was obsessed with the technological revolution, stories about swords and castles didn't sound all that appealing. This created a divide, as fans of the fantasy genre were seen as apart from what was popular, and therefore apart from mainstream culture. However, in 2001, the first Lord of the Rings film was released, and went on to become the second highest grossing film of that year. At the end of 2003, the Lord of the Rings films had collectively grossed over $2 billion at the box office. Fast forward several years, and we see a prime example of fantasy television becoming one of the most popular television shows on the planet. This is, of course, Game of Thrones. So why did we see such a turnaround in mass public interest in fantasy film and television? I think part of the answer lies in the sheer proliferation of The Lord of the Rings as a media franchise. Inspired by the multimedia release of The Matrix in 1999, The Lord of the Rings films were accompanied by web content, video games, merchandise. These relatively new mediums exposed new demographics to the film. The loyal fanbase of the original novels could be counted on to promote the film via word of mouth. The novelty of a film shot in New Zealand rather than the US, and an alternative to the slew of science fiction movies produced at the turn of the millennium, spiked public interest. The films became a talking point, something that one had to see to remain in the loop. Fantasy had finally crossed over into mainstream public interest, but why did it stay there? I would suggest that fantasy has remained popular as a form of opposition to the onslaught of reality television and social media. Fantasy has traditionally been viewed as escapism. With the exposure to so-called reality reaching saturation point, there is no better time than to escape in an episode of Game of Thrones. And yet, even with the transition from fantasy from a niche subcategory to potentially something for everyone, hardcore fan communities still remain. These are the groups that participate in cosplay and conventions, activities that, while they directly relate to something very popular, are still viewed as lame or out of the ordinary. And this is an area in which the creators of The Lord of the Rings really thrive. By continuing to create video games, board games, by holding events and creating merchandise, they continue to cater to the hardcore fan community that was initially instrumental in their success. So, if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, The Chronicles of Narnia, or even Harry Potter, you can give your thanks to The Lord of the Rings, because without its influence, the script for Game of Thrones may have never left the drawing board. Thank you.